Hello and welcome to DebtCircle Sundown Brief for 15th May 2026. Let's take a look at today's key updates from the debt market. Starting with the top 5 highest yield listed corporate bonds. Moneybox Finance Limited recorded a yield of 17.50% with a trade value of 0.50 lakhs. Kirtana Finserv Limited recorded a yield of 17.16% with a trade value of 0.04 lakhs. IIFL Samasta Finance Limited recorded a yield of 16.23% with a trade value of 0.01 lakhs. Edelweiss Asset Reconstruction Company Limited recorded a yield of 15.81% with a trade value of 20 lakhs. Unifins Capital India Limited recorded a yield of 15.50% with a trade value of 0.50 lakhs. Now moving to the top 5 highest yield unlisted corporate bonds. Vadraj Cement Limited recorded a yield of 15.03% with a trade value of 100 lakhs. Another trade from Vadraj Cement Limited recorded a yield of 14.94% with a trade value of 50 lakhs. Apex Homes Private Limited recorded a yield of 14% with a trade value of 4,246.67 lakhs. Swatantra Micro Housing Finance Corporation Limited recorded a yield of 9.36% with a trade value of 138 lakhs. Shriram Finance Limited recorded a yield of 8.08% with a trade value of 5,000 lakhs. Let's now look at mutual fund debt transactions. Gross purchases stood at 11,829.06 crore rupees. Gross sales stood at 17,637.93 crore rupees. Net investment stood at negative 5,808.87 crore rupees. Net investment for April month to date stood at negative 26,249.750 crore rupees. Moving to FPI debt market investments. Gross purchases under general limit stood at 286.07 crore rupees. Under VRR, gross purchases stood at 4.60 crore rupees. Under FAR, gross purchases stood at 705.85 crore rupees. Gross sales under general limit stood at 454.24 crore rupees. Under VRR, gross sales stood at 1,486.93 crore rupees. Under FAR, gross sales stood at 1,914.85 crore rupees. Net investment under general limit stood at negative 168.17 crore rupees. Under VRR, net investment stood at negative 1,482.33 crore rupees. Under FAR, net investment stood at negative 1,209.00 crore rupees. Net investment for April month to date under general limit stood at negative 57.31 crore rupees. Under VRR, it stood at negative 456.26 crore rupees. Under FAR, it stood at 2,942.77 crore rupees. Year-to-date calendar year 2026, net investment under general limit stood at negative 3,352 crore rupees. Under VRR, it stood at negative 1,860 crore rupees. Under FAR, it stood at 13,151 crore rupees. Now let's take a look at money market rates. Call rate stood at 5.24%. T-repo stood at 5.07%. Basket repo stood at 5.11%. Special repo stood at 4.99%. Moving to India government bond yields. 1-year government bond yield stood at 5.99%. 3-year yield stood at 6.48%. 5-year yield stood at 6.90%, 7-year yield stood at 7.04%, 9-year yield stood at 6.97%, 10-year yield stood at 7.06%, 15-year yield stood at 7.38%, 30-year yield stood at 7.66%. Now the Treasury bill yield and auction cutoff. 91-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.34%. 182-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.53%, 364-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.77%. Moving to liquidity indicators. Net liquidity injected stood at negative 2,33,876 crore rupees. Standing deposit facility stood at 2,33,913 crore rupees. Marginal standing facility stood at 37 crore rupees. Now let's review MIBOR OIS rates. 1 year stood at 6.16%, 2 years stood at 6.38%, 3 years stood at 6.52%, 5 years stood at 6.71%. Modified MIFOR rates are as follows. 2 years stood at 7.10%, 3 years stood at 7.08%, 4 years stood at 0.0%, 5 years stood at 7.42%. Moving to currency rates. US dollar to Indian rupee stood at 95.76 rupees compared to the previous 95.77 rupees. Euro to Indian rupee stood at 111.49 rupees compared to the previous 112.08 rupees. British pound to Indian rupee stood at 128.08 rupees compared to the previous 129.41 rupees. Japanese yen to Indian rupee stood at 0.61 rupees, unchanged from the previous 0.61 rupees. Chinese yuan to Indian rupee stood at 14.11 rupees, compared to the previous 14.13 rupees. Now let's look at commodities and indices. Gold 24 carat at 99.9 purity stood at 15,791 rupees per 10 grams, compared to the previous 16,233 rupees. Silver stood at 2,900 rupees per 10 grams, compared to the previous 3,000 rupees. Crude oil stood at $108.21, compared to the previous $105.02. Sensex closed at 75,237.99, compared to the previous 75,398.72. Nifty closed at 23,643.50, compared to the previous 23,689.60. Finally, let's review India primary issuance in corporate bonds. Aditya Birla Capital Limited raised 728 crore rupees with tenure ranging from 34 to 60 months across multiple tranches and coupon ranging from 7.72% to 8.16%. Fincare Financial Services Limited raised 75 crore rupees with a tenure of 28 months and coupon of 11.33%, rated BBB+ by Care Ratings Limited. Hinduja Leyland Finance Limited raised 100 crore rupees with a tenure of 80 months and coupon of 9.30%, rated AA+ by Care Ratings Limited and CRISIL Ratings Limited. National Bank for Financing Infrastructure and Development raised 4,000 crore rupees with a tenure of 121 months and coupon of 7.74%, rated AAA by CRISIL Ratings Limited and ICRA Limited. Kharghar Vikhroli Transmission Limited raised 1,380 crore rupees with tenure ranging from 14 to 236 months across multiple tranches and coupon ranging from 0.00% to 8.56%, rated AA+ by CRISIL Ratings Limited and India Rating and Research Private Limited. Vedika Credit Capital Limited raised 50 crore rupees with a tenure of 61 months and coupon of 11.50%, rated A- by Infomerics Valuation and Rating Private Limited. Tata Capital Housing Finance Limited raised 575 crore rupees with a tenure of 37 months and coupon of 7.85%, rated AAA by CRISIL Ratings Limited and ICRA Limited. That's all for today's DebtCircle Sundown brief. Stay informed, stay ahead, and we'll see you in the next update.